World Without End is a sequel to The Pillars of the Earth. When I first published The Pillars of the Earth, there was no demand for a sequel. The book did not immediately get the kind of reaction that I was hoping for. It was a slow burn, but gradually, over the years, I noticed that when I was talking to readers in libraries and bookshops, and we got to the part where the audience asks questions, sooner or later somebody would say, when are you going to write another book like The Pillars of the Earth? And the rest of them would clap. And, I'm an author who wants to please the readers. I don't write to please myself, I write to please you. And when I had had this question a few times, I had to think very seriously about it. And I realised that The Pillars of the Earth was coming to mean more to people than any of my other books had. And I started thinking about a sequel, but I couldn't write another book about building a cathedral because it would have been the same book. What did people really want when they asked me for a sequel? They wanted another book like that. And so I tried to think of what the sequel could be about and who the characters would be and when it would take place. It couldn't really feature any of the same characters because by the time The Pillars of the Earth comes to an end, some of the principals are dead and the rest are old. There wasn't room for another book. So now that you've read World Without End, one of the things you might talk about in the book group is in what sense this is a sequel to The Pillars of the Earth, and does it have the magic that drew you to The Pillars of the Earth? Does it cast the same kind of spell? Is it really a sequel? One of the things that delayed me in writing the sequel was the search for a theme that would be as grand and as all-encompassing as the building of a great church. You know, what could compare with that for a central idea? And it took me a long time, a lot of thinking about it, and I eventually thought of the Black Death. And I thought what I could do is I could tell the story of the Black Death as it struck Kingsbridge, so that we would see not the same people, but we would see something of the same setup, a monastery and a cathedral and a town, trading town with businessmen and a hinterland of agricultural land ruled over by noblemen and noblewomen. And perhaps something that you might discuss in comparing the two books is the theme of the Black Death as effective as a unifying notion in World Without End as the building of the cathedral is in The Pillars of the Earth? Does it work in the same way? I certainly intended it to, but you're the judges. It's about a terrible plague. The Black Death killed at least a third, maybe a half of the people in Europe and the Middle East and North Africa. Possibly the most dreadful plague that has ever afflicted the human race. People died very quickly. Almost everybody who got it died. People died very quickly. They infected one another very easily. This is the moment when the word quarantine was invented. Italian, it means 40 days in Italian. It's when face masks were invented for medical practitioners and priests who were dealing with infected people. It's when washing your hands became commonplace. And something that might be interesting to discuss would might be this plague, and the plague that we're suffering at the moment, COVID-19. And it might be interesting to compare the two. If you've read World Without End, you know a great deal now about the Black Death. And it might be interesting to say, is COVID-19 like that? Is it better or worse? Is it similar? Could the Black Death even have been a virus like COVID-19? My favourite scene in World Without End, well, the principal hero of the story is Caris. And at one stage, she and another nun have to take a very dangerous and brave trip across France in search of the English king, who must arbitrate a dispute for them. And the English army in France in those days were, the French had a saying, the plague is the English. The English army would set fire to the crops and steal everything that wasn't nailed down. They had a terribly bad reputation. But following in their footsteps, it was very difficult to find anything to eat. And there's a scene where a starving woman comes up to Caris and Maya, the other nun, and asks for food. And Caris gives her some of the very small stock of food that the two of them have. And the woman takes the food, and Maya says to Caris, if you keep doing that, we'll run out of food and we'll starve ourselves. You can't feed these people. And Caris says, we're nuns. We have to feed the hungry. It's up to God to decide when we die. And that is a defining moment in the story. That tells you Caris's fundamental morality. And I like it because it does that. But you might like to discuss what makes this a defining scene, if I'm right. What makes it a defining scene? Are there other defining scenes in the book? Or indeed, in other books, does it remind you of scenes that define characters in other stories, by me or by other people? The Black Death changed people's attitudes to religion and to medicine and to knowledge in general, because the church had previously had a monopoly of medicine, and it was completely unable to help anybody who had the Black Death. The church was completely powerless, and that struck medieval people very forcefully. Church medicine was useless. A typical remedy, for example, was to cut a verse out of the Bible and dissolve it in wine and drink the wine. That was supposed to make you better. That was the level of medieval medicine, and it was almost completely useless. And people changed, and they started, first of all, they turned to informal medical practitioners like midwives and apothecaries, whose earnings depended on how successful they were, unlike the monks and the priests. And there began to be a focus on evidence. Will this cure me? Well, what's the evidence? How do we know? Has it cured people before? How many of them? How do we know that this was what cured the people? And so on. And you might like to discuss, I think that's a turning point in the intellectual history of Europe, but you might like to discuss that. Is it actually a turning point? Is this the moment that led eventually to the creation of modern medicine and the Enlightenment and eventually the arrival of modern science? Was the Black Death the turning point? In the final scene of World Without End, Merlin takes Caris to the top of the tower on the cathedral, and the two of them look down over Kingsbridge, this city where they have spent so many years together and done so much work. And it's clearly intended by the author to be a heavily symbolic moment, and Merthin shows Caris that at the top of the spire he's put a statue of an angel, and the angel has Caris's face. And you might like to ask why I did that, what I was hoping to achieve, whether in fact it achieves anything or perhaps fails. What is the point of that scene? Well, I hope those comments and questions spark some questions and comments in your own minds, and I hope you have a wonderful time at the book group.